Welcome to WWWO Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. February 1st, 1943. The skies over North Africa are a vast, unforgiving battleground. Below, the deserts of Tunisia bake under a relentless sun, a theater of war where Allied and Axis forces are locked in a brutal struggle for control of the Mediterranean. Above, a different war is being fought, a war of altitude, speed, and steel. For the United States Army Air Forces, this is a critical proving ground. Their weapon of choice is the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine heavy bomber designed to fly high, fly far, and absorb punishment that would tear lesser aircraft apart. As part of the 97th Bombardment Group, these bombers and their young crews are tasked with striking deep into enemy territory, targeting strategic ports, airfields, and supply lines that feed the German Afrika Korps. The missions are long and perilous. The thin air at 25,000 feet is brutally cold, often dropping to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen is a lifeline, and frostbite is a constant enemy. Every flight is a journey into a storm of lead and fire. Anti-aircraft batteries on the ground, known to the crews as flak, throw up a deadly curtain of exploding shells, peppering the sky with black puffs of smoke that hide razor-sharp shrapnel. But the greatest threat comes from the sky itself. The Luftwaffe, Germany's formidable air force, patrols these skies with lethal efficiency. Their fighter pilots are seasoned veterans, flying some of the most advanced aircraft of the war. For the American bomber crews, every mission is a roll of the dice, a test of nerve, skill, and the structural integrity of their remarkable machine. This unforgiving crucible of combat forges legends, but it also claims lives with terrifying frequency. It is in this high-stakes arena that our story begins. A story of one aircraft and one crew that would face the ultimate test and emerge as an icon of survival against impossible odds. Among the dozens of B-17s based in Biskra, Algeria, was a B-17F model, serial number 41-24406. She carried the proud, patriotic name All-American painted on her nose. Like her sister ships, she was a marvel of 1940s engineering, bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns that gave the bomber its Flying Fortress moniker. She was a complex beast of aluminum, wire, and hydraulic fluid, powered by four Wright RMS 1000, 820 Cyclone radial engines, each capable of producing 1,200 horsepower. Her 10-man crew was a microcosm of America itself, young men from different states and different walks of life, brought together by war and bound by a shared purpose. At the controls was the pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, a calm and capable leader entrusted with the lives of his 9 crewmen. Beside him, the co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier formed the heart of the aircraft's command and control. In the fuselage, the radio operator, flight engineer, 2 waist gunners, a ball turret gunner, and a tail gunner manned their defensive positions. their eyes constantly scanning the skies for threats. On this particular morning, the mission was a familiar one, a daylight precision bombing raid. The target was the strategic German-held seaport of Bizerte in Tunisia, a critical hub for Axis supplies. The briefing was somber and professional. The men studied maps, synchronized their watches, and reviewed intelligence reports on expected flak concentrations and enemy fighter activity. They knew the risks. The flight to the target and back would cover hundreds of miles, much of it over hostile territory. Every man understood that their survival depended not just on their own skill, but on the discipline of their formation flying and the collective firepower of the entire bomber group. As they walked out to the hardstand where all American waited, the morning air was cool, but the tension was palpable. They performed their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, the familiar smells of oil and high-octane fuel filling the air. Soon the engines sputtered to life, one by one, their roar building to a crescendo that shook the very ground. All American was ready. Her crew was ready. They were about to fly into a day that would etch their names into the annals of aviation history. As the American bomber stream climbed towards its operational altitude, they were being watched. On airfields across Tunisia, the pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 53, the famed pick as, or ace of spades group, scrambled to their fighters. Their primary weapon was the Messerschmitt Bf 109, specifically the G or Gustav model. It was a deadly interceptor, fast, agile, and armed with a powerful combination of machine guns and a 20 cannon that fired explosive shells through the propeller hub. The pilots of JG-53 were not novices. They were experienced combatants, many of them aces with numerous victories to their names. One such pilot was Erich Paxia, a decorated ace credited with 9 aerial victories. He and his fellow pilots had refined their tactics against the heavily armed American bombers. They knew that a frontal, head-on attack was the most effective, albeit the most dangerous, approach. A B-17 formation was a porcupine of defensive fire, with machine guns covering nearly every angle. However, the nose of the bomber had fewer guns and was considered a relative weak point. A head-on pass, executed at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, gave the bomber's gunners only a few terrifying seconds to track and fire. The goal was to disrupt the cockpit, targeting the pilots to send the massive plane spiraling out of control, or to ignite a fire in one of the wing-mounted fuel tanks. This tactic required immense skill and nerves of steel. A slight miscalculation, a moment of hesitation, and the fighter pilot could fly directly into the bomber or its defensive wall of lead. On this day, German radar stations tracked the inbound American formation, vectoring the Bf 109s to an ideal interception point. The German pilots climbed steeply, using the sun's glare to mask their approach. Their orders were clear: break up the formation, shoot down as many bombers as possible, and force the rest to turn back. For Erich Paxia and his squadron, All American and her sister ships were not just targets, they were invaders, symbols of an enemy air force attempting to strangle the German war effort in Africa. The stage was set for a violent confrontation high above the Tunisian landscape, 25,000 feet over Bizerte. The world below is a patchwork of tan desert and the sparkling blue of the Mediterranean. For the crew of All American, there is no time to admire the view. As they approach the initial point, the point where the final bomb run begins, the sky erupts. Puffs of black smoke, the telltale sign of flak, blossom around the formation. The aircraft is rocked by the concussions of nearby explosions, and the sharp, metallic patter of shrapnel striking the fuselage sounds like hail on a tin roof. Inside, the crew is a study in focused intensity. The pilots, Bragg and his co-pilot, fight to keep the bomber steady on its course, flying through the turbulence. In the nose, the bombardier lies on his stomach, his eye pressed to the legendary Norden bombsight, guiding the aircraft towards its final destination. His voice comes over the intercom, calm and precise, giving small course corrections to the pilot. Then comes the call. Bomb bay doors open. A low hydraulic hum fills the plane as the doors swing wide, exposing the belly of the aircraft to the freezing air. The final seconds crawl by. The bombardier makes his last adjustments, and with a firm press of a button, he calls out bombs away. All American lurches upwards, suddenly lighter by several thousand pounds as its deadly payload begins its long descent. The mission's primary objective is complete, but their ordeal has just begun. The moment the bombs are released, the German fighters who had been holding back to avoid the flak make their move. They appear as mere specks at first, then grow with terrifying speed. The intercom crackles to life with urgent calls from the gunners. Fighters, 12 o'clock high. Bandits closing fast. The sky transforms into a maelstrom of crisscrossing tracer fire. The 50 caliber machine guns of the B-17s roar in defiance, their deep, rhythmic thumping a counterpoint to the high-pitched chatter of the German cannons. The air is filled with the acrid smell of cordite. It is a chaotic, three-dimensional ballet of death, where survival is measured in feet and seconds. Leading one of the head-on attacks was German ace Erich Paxia. His Bf-109G screamed towards the front of the bomber formation, its engine at full throttle. He lined up on one of the B-17s, his cannon and machine guns blazing. The American gunners in the nose and top turret returned fire, filling the air between the two aircraft with a stream of 50 caliber rounds. What happened next occurred in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Perhaps Paxia's plane was hit by defensive fire. Perhaps he was wounded, or he simply misjudged the incredible closing speed. Instead of breaking away below the bomber as planned, his fighter continued on its collision course. The crew of All American felt a cataclysmic jolt, a violent shudder that felt as if the hand of God had swatted them from the sky. It was accompanied by a deafening shriek of tearing metal that momentarily drowned out the roar of the engines and the cacophony of battle. Paxia's Messerschmitt had slammed into their bomber. The fighter's wing, a rigid spar of German steel, acted like a giant cleaver, slicing deep into the B-17's rear fuselage just ahead of the tail assembly. For a fraction of a second, the two aircraft were locked together in a fatal embrace. Then, The immense forces tore the Bf-109 apart. The German fighter disintegrated, its wreckage scattered into the slipstream. Paxia was killed instantly. Inside All-American, the shockwave of the impact threw the men against their stations. The bomber, its structural integrity fatally compromised, immediately went into a violent, uncontrolled dive. Alarms blared in the cockpit as the plane spiraled towards the Tunisian desert thousands of feet below. To everyone who witnessed it, from the crews in the surrounding bombers to any observer on the ground, All-American looked doomed. The tail section was nearly severed, hanging on by just a few scraps of metal and the floor of the fuselage. No aircraft could possibly survive such catastrophic damage. The laws of aerodynamics were absolute, and for All-American, the verdict appeared to be terminal. As All-American plunged from the sky, a chilling scene of devastation was revealed to the crew. The tail gunner, miraculously unharmed, found himself completely isolated, looking out through a gaping hole at his own aircraft's tail, which was now flapping violently in the wind. The waist gunners peered back into a scene of utter destruction. The entire left horizontal stabilizer and elevator were simply gone, sheared off by the impact. The vertical stabilizer, the iconic tail fin of the B-17, was deeply gashed and twisted, its structural spars shattered. The right horizontal stabilizer was also heavily damaged, its control surfaces rendered useless. The fuselage itself was peeled open like a tin can, exposing the internal framework to the freezing gale. Control cables, the vital arteries that connected the pilot's controls to the tail surfaces, were severed and whipping wildly in the wind. The tail wheel was jammed, its mechanism destroyed. The bomber was essentially flying without a tail. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg and his co-pilot wrestled with their control columns, muscles straining against the immense aerodynamic forces tearing at their aircraft. The plane was in a tight spiral, losing thousands of feet per minute. The controls felt dead, disconnected. It was an aviator's worst nightmare. Yet, amidst the chaos, a remarkable sense of discipline took hold. The 10-man crew, trained for just such emergencies, began to assess the situation. A quick check over the intercom confirmed the most astonishing fact of all. Not a single crewman had been injured in the collision. There were no casualties. This small miracle provided a sliver of hope in a seemingly hopeless situation. But hope alone could not fly a crippled bomber. Bragg knew that if they couldn't pull out of this dive, the immense G-forces would soon tear the rest of the plane apart. He needed a solution, and he needed it now. The aircraft was bleeding altitude, the ground rushing up to meet them. They were fighting not just a damaged machine, but the fundamental laws of physics. Pulling an airplane out of an uncontrolled dive with no tail controls is, by all accounts, impossible. But Lieutenant Bragg and his crew were about to attempt it. Bragg and his co-pilot used the only tools they had left: the 4 engines and the small ailerons on the wings. By varying the throttle settings on the engines, increasing power on one side while decreasing it on the other, they could generate a crude turning force, a technique known as differential thrust. It was a blunt instrument, a desperate and physically exhausting struggle to impose their will on the dying aircraft. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to arrest the spin. The dive steepened, then shallowed. Then, against all odds, the nose of All-American began to inch its way back towards the horizon. They had stopped the spiral, but the plane was still dangerously unstable. The mangled tail section was acting like a rudderless sail in a hurricane, causing the plane to oscillate wildly, a phenomenon known as a Dutch roll. The crew in the rear of the aircraft realized they had to do something to dampen this terrifying motion. In a moment of sheer battlefield ingenuity, the two waist gunners and the radio man devised a plan. They took their own parachutes, still in their packs, and attached them to the 50 caliber machine guns at the waist positions. They then fed the parachute lines out through the gaping hole in the fuselage, using their bodies as anchors against the ferocious wind. They intended to deploy the parachutes to act as drogues, creating drag at the rear of the aircraft to help stabilize the yawing motion. It was an unproven, desperate gamble. As they carefully played out the lines, the small pilot chutes caught the wind first, followed by the main canopies, which billowed out into the slipstream. The effect was immediate. The violent oscillations lessened. The bomber became more sluggish, but also more predictable. They had created a makeshift air brake, a jury-rigged solution that gave Bragg just enough stability to maintain a semblance of level flight. They were still flying, but their journey was far from over. They were deep in enemy territory, flying a crippled bomber that felt like it could disintegrate at any moment. The crews of the other B-17s in the formation had watched in horror as All-American was hit. They saw the German fighter explode and the American bomber fall away, seemingly out of control. By all rights, they should have seen 10 parachutes blossom as the crew bilayed out. But no parachutes appeared. Instead, they witnessed the impossible. All-American, slowly, painstakingly, clawed its way back from the brink and leveled out. Seeing that their comrades were still fighting, the commander of the formation made a decision that flew in the face of standard procedure. Normally, a crippled bomber that could not maintain formation speed would be left behind, a grim necessity to ensure the safety of the rest of the group. But this was different. This was an act of survival so profound that it demanded a different response. The entire formation of B-17s throttled back, slowing their pace to match that of the struggling All-American. They tightened their defensive box, creating a protective shield of bristling machine guns around their wounded friend. Any Luftwaffe pilot looking for an easy kill would now have to fly through a concentrated wall of fire from dozens of heavy machine guns. P-38 Lightning fighters, the long-range escorts for the mission, also took notice. Several of them broke from their high cover and descended, taking up close escort positions on the wings of the crippled bomber. They became personal bodyguards, their presence a clear message to any remaining German fighters. This bomber does not fly alone. This act of solidarity was more than just a tactical decision. It was a profound display of the unspoken bond that existed between air crews. They were a brotherhood forged in the lethal skies over Europe and Africa. They trained together, flew together, and sometimes they perished together. On this day, They chose to risk their own safety to give the crew of All American a fighting chance to make it home. For the men inside the battered bomber, the sight of their comrades closing in around them was an immeasurable boost to their morale. They were not abandoned. They were being escorted home by their brothers. The flight back to Biskra airfield was a grueling 90-minute ordeal that stretched every man's endurance to its breaking point. Every gust of wind, every patch of turbulence sent a terrifying shudder through the airframe. The crew could hear the groaning and creaking of stressed metal, the constant, horrifying sound of their aircraft slowly tearing itself apart. The wind howled through the massive hole in the fuselage, a deafening roar that made communication nearly impossible. The temperature inside plummeted, and the men shivered, not just from the cold, but from the adrenaline and the ever-present fear. In the cockpit, Bragg and his co-pilot were in a constant battle. Flying the plane was a purely physical act. Without the aid of their tail controls, they had to make continuous, minute adjustments to the throttles and ailerons. Their arms and shoulders ached with the strain of keeping the heavy bomber level. The makeshift parachutes dragging behind them helped, but they also made the plane sluggish and unresponsive. They were flying on a knife's edge, where a single mistake could send them into a final, unrecoverable spin. The navigator worked feverishly, charting the most direct course home, away from known flak batteries and enemy airfields. The radio operator sent out a distress call, alerting their home base to the emergency and their estimated time of arrival. Every man was acutely aware of their vulnerability. They were flying low and slow, a tempting target for any enemy aircraft. But their escort held firm, a vigilant flock of guardians surrounding them. For the 10 men of All American, those 90 minutes felt like an eternity. Each passing minute was a small victory, another mile closer to the safety of friendly territory. They flew over the desolate mountains and plains of North Africa, a landscape indifferent to their struggle. Their world had shrunk to the vibrating metal shell around them, their focus narrowed to one single, all-consuming goal: survive. As Biskra airfield finally came into view, a new wave of anxiety swept through the crew of All American. They had survived the collision, the dive, and the long flight home, but their greatest challenge still lay ahead: landing. An aircraft's tail is essential for a controlled landing. It provides the pitch and yaw control necessary for a stable approach. All American had almost no tail. Furthermore, its tail wheel was destroyed, meaning the rear of the aircraft would slam onto the runway with nothing to support it. A normal landing was out of the question. On the ground, emergency crews scrambled into position. Fire trucks and ambulances raced to the sides of the runway. Everyone at the base knew the crippled bomber was coming in, and they gathered to watch, fearing the worst but hoping for a miracle. Lieutenant Bragg began his approach. He knew he had only one chance to get this right. He had to bring the plane in faster than usual to maintain airflow over what was left of his control surfaces. His plan was to use engine power to keep the tail off the ground for as long as possible after the main landing gear touched down. As he lined up with the runway, he could feel the plane fighting him, wanting to drop its heavy, mangled tail. He made his final approach, his hands steady on the controls. The massive bomber skimmed over the edge of the runway, its main wheels just feet above the ground. With incredible finesse, Bragg let the plane settle, and the tires of the main gear chirped as they made contact with the tarmac. The moment they were down, he continued to apply power, holding the nose high and the tail in the air. The plane roared down the runway on just two wheels, a precarious balancing act between lift and gravity. Finally, as the airspeed bled off, he could hold it no longer. He cut the power to all four engines. The tail dropped with a deafening screech, sending a shower of sparks flying as the bare metal of the fuselage scraped along the runway. The bomber skidded, slewed sideways, and finally, mercifully, came to a stop. For a moment there was a stunned silence. Then the airfield erupted in cheers. The crew of All American had done the impossible. They were home. Once the dust settled, the ground crews and fellow airmen stared in disbelief at the aircraft sitting on their runway. The damage was even worse than they had imagined. The tail was connected to the fuselage by only two small pieces of the top fuselage skin and a section of the floor. It was a testament to the sheer ruggedness of the Boeing B-17. The aircraft had been designed with a high degree of structural redundancy, a feature that had undoubtedly saved the lives of these 10 men. The now famous photograph of All American was taken shortly after, showing a crewman peering out of the massive gash in the fuselage, the tail hanging on by a prayer. This single image would become one of the most iconic of the air war, a powerful symbol of American resilience and engineering. Lieutenant Bragg and his crew were hailed as heroes. Their story of survival, a mix of incredible skill, battlefield ingenuity, and sheer luck, spread like wildfire. It served as a massive morale booster for Allied aircrews everywhere, who flew daily missions knowing the terrible risks involved. The story of All American told them that their aircraft could take an incredible amount of punishment and still bring them home. It reinforced the faith they had in their machines and in each other. The aircraft itself, however, had flown its last mission. Though some believed it could be repaired, the damage was too extensive. The All-American was carefully cut apart and salvaged for parts, her heroic duty done. But her legacy was cemented. She became more than just an airplane. She was a legend. The story of the B-17 that flew home with a severed tail is a powerful reminder of the human element in warfare. It is a story not just about a machine, but about the courage, discipline, and unbreakable will of a 10-man crew who refused to give up, who fought against impossible odds, and who, together, achieved one of the most remarkable feats of survival in the history of aerial combat. Thank you for joining WWWO Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.